Hi, Wiltsy here. I want to make a quick little video about armor weapons and sort of what armor weapon is best specifically for your specific situation, because there's sort of this tendency, I think, for teams to look at armor weapons as one is the best, and like if you want armor you always play that one specific one, and I think that's too simplified. Most teams don't get the same things out of an armor weapon. And what the rest of your team wants out of an armor weapon and your own personal skills and players can also impact what armor weapon is best. And so I kind of want to just go through every single armor weapon in the game and talk about sort of the pros and cons and why you might want or not want that armor weapon on your team. So, here's a little chart I made. I mean, you can kind of see. Don't worry about the bottom line right now. I'll kind of talk about that at a later point. But just talking about what the armor weapons do in a team comp, these are ones I consider to be like specifically focused on the support aspect, although all of them do it in a different way. So I'll kind of talk about the differences between the different ways they support, whereas this is kind of a middle ground. I think it's just n-zap, that's it. But I think n-zap's kind of middle ground between being sort of a K-shot kind of aggro player and also being an armor. Whereas these ones are a bit more focused on what the main weapon does, and they just have armor. You don't normally run Tri to get a lot of armors. You run it as a armor weapon that specifically does what Tri does, which is slosher things and kill things quickly and whatever. And then these are sort of their own thing entirely, where they're kind of like aggro weapon with armor, where they do their own thing but have armor, but they're of course different from what these weapons do because they're more defensive. So talking about the pure support, back in the game we've got Junior. This is kind of what I run on Junior. So the main thing about Junior is that it paints a lot, throws a lot of bombs, and gets a lot of armors. 180 point special. And you'll often see like sub saver, latches effort, as well as the special charge stuff. I personally run more swim speed than most people see. You'll usually see more like bomb and special oriented stuff. And you'll see like the double bomb builds, which I personally don't think is actually worth it, but it's pretty normal to see. Of course, Junior paints very quickly. And I mean like very quickly. Gets armor quickly. Throw a lot of bombs. Bombs are very helpful. If you saw my team comp video, you can see me talking about how you can use bombs to create openings and pressure from a distance and potentially even get picks. Mostly when the bomb is in combination with something else going on, because otherwise they can just dodge the bomb. So just like the bombs alone will do a lot to help your team out. You can use that to help create openings for your team or pressure from a distance while your team does something else. And the turf output, of course, allows your team more space to work with. You can quickly cap or contest zone and splat zones. It gets armor quickly. And of course it should be pretty self-explanatory why they help your team. That's what this video is all about, is armor weapons. So of course, armor weapons gives you a layer of armor, makes it easier to take fights. That also makes it easier to kind of overwhelm your opponent by having multiple people armor pushing together. So, sort of, Junior is focused solely on setting up the rest of the team. It doesn't do very much itself other than like paint zone and splat zones. It's almost exclusively meant to set up the rest of your team. And because of that, I think it's mostly good for team comps. Actually, anything in the category I'm going to go into, I think is mostly suited for team comps that specifically have weapons they want to set up. And so, like, if you have a blaster, your blaster's not gonna... Like a custom blaster, they're gonna want armors for the inkjet, they're gonna want a turf to work with because the blaster doesn't paint very well. And then you can use bombs to help get the blaster in, things like that. I don't personally think Junior is really worth it if your team comp doesn't really have weapons that specifically benefit from the extra turf, bombs, and armor that Junior provides. I think in that case you're better off just picking an armor weapon that also does things other than just get armors. And of course, last thing I'll mention before moving on is a concept I've brought up before in previous videos, if you noticed, which is safe painting versus quick painting. Junior is one of the best weapons in the game as far as quick painting. You can pretty much just paint anything in any shape really quickly. Which makes it good for painting zone because, like, no matter what part of zone is unpainted or what shape the zone is, you can just, like, immediately paint zone, pretty much. But the one downside to quick painting is that you have to be close by. It paints very quickly, but it paints in an area you have to be within range of. So it's mostly good for safely contesting an area if you have other things keeping the focus off of you, or quickly painting up an area that's uncontested. Whereas safe painting, usually the weapons that safe paint aren't as good at painting. Like I'm going to use H3 as an example, which is actually pretty quick with his safe painting as well, but it's like H3 paints in lines. Long lines. So it does still paint pretty quickly, but it's more of a focus on painting far away. Whereas if you have to paint a splat zone that's like wide, then either you have to like move around to just angle it right to get the lines to line up right, or you take longer by having to kind of overshoot the zone. But like the turf output on something like H3 is better focus on sort of painting an area that you can't get to, which can sort of safely assist with your team, lay down some turf for your teammates to push in on without putting yourself at risk, and it can also just like gain special for you without having to commit in, because it's very easy to paint an area that the other team has control over since you don't actually have to commit to it. Whereas Junior, you kind of have to commit to those kinds of things, but of course, just the way Junior paints and the bombs and everything else do give Junior a different edge, if that makes sense. So I think safe painting and quick painting are both important things to consider, and one isn't better than the other, it's just they kind of do different things. So talking about H3, like I already talked about, it's kind of, in a way it's kind of like a safe painting Junior, where it doesn't quite paint as fast and doesn't get as many armors because it's a 220 point special as opposed to 180 point, which makes a pretty big difference in how many armors you get. On top of that, it also has this sort of range threat. It can potentially one clip, yeah, all 3 shots and 1 shots, or 3 shots. But it's hard to pull off, especially on a moving target, so it's a little bit unreliable in the kill threat. It's more of, yeah. Like Junior gets more bombs, which is kind of a range threat, but like H3 is more consistent with bombs, but less range, but also less consistent than something like a Nautilus or a K-Pro. But of course you can run the main power build, which is about the same amount of main power as K-Pro, or I think it is the exact same amount for the 49.9, where it's like 3 mains and 4 subs. Where is my shoes for this? Ah, this page. So of course you sacrifice a lot on things like special charge and sub saver, and it means you're sacrificing on the support aspect to get more out of the damage output part of it. It's a bit easier to get kills with it, a bit easier to be a consistent kill threat at mid-range, but you're giving up getting as many armors and focusing on being like a range threat with armor, which would put this weapon more in the one of the other categories I'm going to be talking about. And that kind of gives an interesting aspect where you can, it's the same weapon but it can do two different things in a team comp depending on which you'd rather have. Then there's 96, which is kind of a similar thing, mostly to the damage up H3, but yeah. So I don't really have a build for this thing, so I'm just gonna pull something up. The two main kinds of builds you'll see for this are MPO for like 70 damage or 72 damage. So this does have sort of a similar safe painting to the H3. It's a little bit splotchier, but it's a similar kind of use in a team comp. It's got a bit more range and it can potentially two-shot. There's the shot RNG to keep in mind, but is pretty consistent kill threat at long range. There are no bombs, which is a bit of a downside. Bombs are just really nice and do a lot of things. You pretty much want as many bombs in your comp as possible without sacrificing on something else in most cases. But of course, by having that 70 damage, or you combo with any weapon that does 30 damage or more, and it also combos with bomb indirects, since those are 70. Although if the other team has bomb defense, that will no longer combo with the bomb indirects, because I think it takes it down to like 28.5 damage with one sub of bomb defense. And that's kind of where the 72 damage build comes in. So instead of a pure, you have 2 extra subs, which isn't too much more of an investment. And you can use 70, especially if you're not going to get very much out of the extra 2 damage. I think if you are going to get things out of the extra 2 damage, it's worth having it. So that'll combo with things like n-zap or tetras, or you run Splash-O-Matic without main power. Anything that does 28 damage. And then also combos with bomb indirects if the other team has, if your opponent has a sub-up bomb defense. So it's a little bit easier to get those damage combos, and of course the benefit of this is that with the range and the damage combos, you can pretty much just finish off or assist in fights that your teammates are taking, and it's very good at that. Because most weapons only have to get, I mean, like, most weapons as in anything except arrow spray, and nobody plays arrow spray, so anything except arrow spray will damage combo with this with one shot. And that's a very strong tool to have. Because that turns it from a 2-shot to essentially a one-shotting weapon, one assisting teammates, with a lot of range. So 96 sort of has that safe painting of H3, but it focuses less on the armors and the bombs in exchange for being really good at assisting in fights with the main weapon. Then the last thing in my pure support category is Ken's Undercover Umbrella, which is... This is one of the ones I'm a little bit iffy on whether or not it's actually worth playing or not. So you can kind of run a similar build to Junior for the most part. Like special charge and self-saver type stuff. Throw torpedoes. It used to be meta because torpedoes were just stronger, while also teams weren't as used to dealing with torpedoes, so... Like, the torpedo itself was what made it good in the first place, whereas now it's a lot harder to get as much use out of the torpedoes. The weapon can technically do, like, a damage combo with rolled torpedoes, but again, with bomb defense, that combo is just cancelled out, and it's kind of hard to pull off consistently because it's an undercover umbrella that's not gonna hit 40 every time you shoot them, especially against a moving target. And it's got, like, the weapon itself has low damage output in general, and it's like, it's technically a 3-shot, and even then it's a slow 3-shot, but like the umbrella aspect also means you might get like 4 or 5-shot kills if you're not hitting all your pellets. And it does have the shield, but the shield has pretty low health. And so to me, the main thing Undercover has going for it is the fact that it is actually really nice on tower and tower control. Because you have torpedoes. Torpedoes are a bit easier to assist your teammates from tower because they actually lock onto people, whereas with things like Splat Bomb and Auto Bomb, it's a bit harder to consistently assist your teammates from tower because you might just not have a good shot on people with those. And if you have something like a 96 cal, you can have ranged assist from tower, but it relies on people to be within range of the tower. So torpedoes are particularly easy to assist with teammates from tower, and then the umbrella itself makes it a little bit easier to survive on tower by just tanking a few more shots. But when it's not on tower, I think it's a bit weaker, and if you can get a lot of use out of it, specifically when it's not on the tower, because when it is on tower is when it's easier to get use out of, but if you can be good enough at the weapon to get use of it outside of what it does on tower, I think it's worth using for tower control, but outside of that, it's pretty hard to justify over other options, I think. And so the next category I had was just the one weapon, so I'm not going to go back to that screen just to show it, but aggro support with n-zap. Oh, what am I doing? Yeah, this is why I personally run. I used to run a bit of run speed and main power, but I don't feel like really gain too much out of that small amount. But it is pretty normal to see run speed and main power on the weapon. Alongside like the special shard and stuff. It is 78 or 28 damage, which means it does not break armor without object shredder, which is also the same with Junior, but Junior doesn't really take fights, so I didn't really mention it. But this is like n-zap and Junior are often compared to each other, which I think is kind of understandable because they have about the same range, and it's like pretty much the difference is that Junior paints better and throws a bit more bombs, but in exchange, it's not as good at killing things as n-zap is. And that's kind of the simplest explanation. They're both short-range shooters. They have about the same strengths and weaknesses outside of that. The main benefit of n-zap is that, well, it doesn't paint as much and throw as many bombs. It does more on its own, because it can kind of hold its ground. Junior, anytime it takes a fight, it has to run away, but n-zap has a much better time actually taking those fights. And so, because of that, I think, comparing specifically Junior and n-zap, if you have a team comp that doesn't specifically benefit from the extra turf and bombs and whatnot from the Junior, I think you're much better off having n-zap, because then you have another weapon that can actually do things in your comp, rather than focusing solely on setting up the rest of the comp. And meanwhile, it still does plenty to set up the rest of your comp. You can support the rest of your team with armors and bombs and things. So I think n-zap's kind of the weapon where you want something that supports your comp, but you don't really need something that's purely there to support your comp and does nothing other than support your comp, because I think that can be more of a detriment than a benefit for a lot of team comps. It all depends on what you're planning on setting up, more than what the armor weapon itself is. Then we have the aggro weapon with armor category, which is, these are weapons where I wouldn't really consider them support at all. They don't really do things outside of the armor to really support the rest of your team. It's more that the main and sub do their own thing while the special is armor. And it's kind of a similar category to n-zap, where it's like, if you want armor but don't really need a weapon that sets up the rest of your team, you can pick something from here, but it's even further down, because n-zap still does paint a lot and get a lot of bombs and whatnot, whereas something like Tri is almost exclusively what it does as a main weapon, and then the armor is just a bonus. It's just like having armor as a special, just like any other special, like having missiles on K-Shot or whatnot. It doesn't get a lot of armors, it's just, yeah, it has armor. So first of all, tri-slosher, which I use the same build on this as I do with n-zap, because I pretty much use it in the same way within my own team. But of course, tri-slosher, the main benefits are that it has pretty fast kill time. It's also a slosher, which makes it good at slosher things, mostly hitting things over walls and ledges and whatnot. The short range is a little bit of a detriment, but it's a trade-off, not just solely a bad thing. You trade off for a good kill time and the other benefits in the weapon. Then it has burst bombs, which for one damage combo with main weapon, you can use that for a very quick kill time if you can sneak up on somebody, mostly. It gives them much less time to potentially react and dodge your attacks and counterattack you and whatnot. And burst bombs also help a lot with assisting your teammates, where you can just like throw one and immediately put some chip damage on some of your teammate fighting. It's a trade-off between bombs, because bombs are better at sort of pressuring an area safely and things like that, but burst bombs are sort of an immediate assisting tool, whereas bombs you can use to assist in fights, but it's much easier for the other team to just run away from the bomb and survive the bomb, and the bomb doesn't really do anything besides make them move slightly, but it's just like a minor inconvenience, whereas burst bombs are a lot easier to sort of consistently assist in fights. They're always going to be helpful for your teammates. And a big part about how this weapon plays is how the burst bombs and the main weapon combo together. I mentioned the damage combo already. On top of that, like, just burst bombs are really good on the same maps and the same parts of the maps where the main weapon is, mostly areas with a lot of height differences. And in general, the burst bomb just complements the main weapon very well. It also gives you mobility tools because it's a bit slow at painting. It kind of paints fine, but it doesn't paint very much, if that makes sense. So you don't exactly run this weapon to make up for turf deficiency in your comp. It paints okay enough. And the burst bombs help for like that sort of really quick turfing for mobility. Just makes your movement much more efficient in parts of the map that you don't have painted already. And kind of like how you can throw bombs with Junior and then armor and throw more bombs, you can, without any sub-saver, just throw 2 burst bombs, armor, throw 2 burst bombs for this cool mini bomb rush. Which is pretty cool. It's not really a selling point of the weapon, it's just like a little bonus that can sometimes be nice every once in a while. And if you've been paying attention to like my gameplay stuff, you'll notice that I'm pretty much a tri-slosher main at this point, because in our comp we want armor, but we don't really want a weapon that just solely focuses on support. We want armor weapons that sort of hold their own ground and act as a aggro weapon as part of our main slaying force. Because that's what fits our team's strategy and comp the best. So I mostly play Tri and then n-zap on maps where Tri is a bit awkward. And then next in this category is Brush, which is... Brush is kind of its own thing. Where it sort of... It does have that fast kill time at short range. And it paints very well. Kind of that quick painting. I think it's the highest raw turf output in the game is Ink Brush. It's like 90 points a second, whereas Junior is like 55 or so. It's insane turf output, really. But the main thing about Brush is the sort of dodge tanking it does, where it's just very hard to hit and kind of be just a pain for the other team to deal with. You can kind of push in and just be really hard to hit, but if they ignore you, then you just run up there and kill them. So they have to pay attention to you, but you're really good at staying alive. So that's kind of what you run Brush for. And most of the time you're better off with Permabrush in my opinion, because the baller just complements that playstyle so well. If you're stuck in a tough spot, you just immediately baller and get out. You can use that to survive anything pretty much. But the armor, Permabrush is alright. Again, I will say that if you want to brush your team comp, I highly recommend picking Permabrush, or Nouveau. I might have actually called it Permabrush earlier, but I recommend picking Nouveau with the baller over this, because the baller just complements the playstyle of the brush so much. And you're not going to get as much out of the brush itself when you run armor. It's a trade-off where the brush isn't as good at being a brush, but it has armor, so it does a bit more for your team. And if you specifically benefit from a brush that does brush things on its own, but also has those armors to assist the rest of the team while doing that, then you can consider Permabrush for sure. And the high turf output means that it does get a lot of armors. Probably should have actually put this in the other category where it's kind of in the middle ground like n-zap, but whatever, I'm already making the video at this point. Like halfway through it. This Kensa goes, which I don't even know what to run on it, so I'm not gonna pull up a build for it, but they do good things. Damage output is okay pre-roll, but post-roll it's like insane. I don't have very much experience with dueling, so I'm just not really used to where to aim after rolling, so bear with me on that. But it's sort of a dueling where you don't necessarily use the dodge rolls so much to stay alive as to initiate fights and just immediately two-shot people. It also has fizzies, which are nice. You can use that as a mobility roll, you can use it as a way to pressure areas. Whatever. So this is a weapon where like the armor is pretty much irrelevant. Like it gets armors, but it's not gonna get very many armors. You're gonna get like 2 or 3 per game probably. You pick it for the fizzy bomb and the main weapon. Alright, so the last category of armor weapons I want to talk about is the defensive weapons with armor, where they kind of are a bit more about holding an area and defending an area and controlling an area. And then they do get armors, but again, kind of like everything except the top category, they don't get a ton of armors. They just sort of have armor. So first of all is Hydra, which I used to actually main, like the beginning of my competitive experience. I dropped it pretty quickly though. So it just didn't really fit what my team really wanted out of a ranged option or whatever. But yeah, Hydra, you don't really pick it for the armor, you pick it for the Hydra. This is not going to get many armors, and if you want to build your team strategy around the armors, I wouldn't recommend using the Hydra as your armor weapon. You can have the Hydra and it gives you a bit extra armors, but you don't want to pick this weapon as your main armor weapon, if that makes sense. Because it's not going to consistently get armor quickly. It's more, it stays alive for a long time and will just every once in a while get an armor. So the main benefit of Hydra is that it just kills things really quickly at max range. The mobility isn't great. Like, this is my personal optimal gear, and this is like the best mobility I can get without sacrificing on other things. And even then, it's very immobile and hard to keep up with your team, but if you can manage to do that, it's just practically impossible to approach, because it just murders everything in sight. So you kind of, if you can get a Hydra set up, it's just an unstoppable wall. But again, as an armor weapon, you're not going to want to use this as your main armor weapon in your team comp if you want to build your strategy around armor. Otherwise, like, it's like the armor is always going to be helpful. If you want this to be your only armor weapon, like, that's fine. It's just you're gonna want to keep in mind that you're only gonna get armors every once in a while, and you can't rely on it as part of your main strategy. Yeah, that's kind of true with tri-slosher and Glugas as well. So, Gold Dynamo, this is... I mean, if you've been watching the channel at all, you'll know that I used to be a Dynamo main, like, when I've... much more recently than I was a Hydra main. So I was actually a Dynamo main for most of the time I've been doing this channel. I just dropped it more recently to have something that pushed up with the team better, because we decided that fit our team comp better. But of course, what Gold Dynamo does is it's Dynamo. It's like this range threat. The range threat isn't as consistently threatening as something like a Hydra or a Charger, but it still does have a pretty long range. Actually, I think like... where's around here. So max range is actually about Hydra range, which might surprise you if you're not familiar with Dynamo. But of course max range doesn't do as much damage. The main benefit of it is what it does at close range, in which case it's just this sort of wall of ink that flings at you is very hard to dodge. And so it is just, once you get this in an area, it's, again, kind of like with Hydra, it's very hard to approach. And it does get a decent amount of armors. It paints, it sort of has a weird combination of safe painting and quick painting where vertical flakes do safe painting pretty solidly, and the horizontals do quick painting pretty well. So it is kind of a supportive weapon, but it's also the main benefit of it is that it holds and controls an area very well. And the support it does is largely going to be centered around the area it's controlling. Outside of the others it gets. And the bombs are nice to have as well. Mostly if you don't have a good opening to use your main weapon, because it does take time. If you're not safe to use your main weapon, you just like throw a bomb and move away. Squiffer is... This is a weapon I don't recommend. I'll just straight up say I don't recommend playing this Squiffer specifically. The other two Squiffers are actually pretty good, but like, this one just feels inferior to the other two Squiffers. And that largely comes down to the fact that it's point sensor. So, I mean, Squiffer as a main weapon is actually pretty decent. It's kind of a short-range charger option similar to Bamboo. It plays different from Bamboo and takes slightly different skills, but it kind of does the same thing in a team comp. But, of course, like... Let's see... The other two Squiffers both have bombs and good specials, and... Just like these two variants of the weapon are overall better than this one. So I think if you really want a weapon that does what Squiffer does, you're better off either using one of the other Squiffers or one of the Bamboos. And then having a separate armor weapon. For instance, instead of having like a classic Squiffer and a T-Tech together, I think it would be better to have the orange Squiffer with Inkjet and Suction Bomb, and then an n-zap. But yeah, that's Squiffer. And then Rapid Pro Deco is kind of weird. I don't really have a build for it or anything, so I'm just going with this. But it's sort of a weird weapon where it kind of safe pains. It does a lot of chip damage, but doesn't really handle close range fights very well. You kind of have to direct and then force shot or something. It's hard to pull off at close range. It's mostly a weapon where you want to stay back. And it's just, as a main weapon, it's kind of hard to recommend using this in a comp. If you have somebody who's really good at the main weapon, then sure, but for the most part, I think it's just a hard weapon to justify using. But that sort of a range threat while also having chip damage and being a blaster to shoot around walls and corners and whatnot is nice. And the wall is also nice for this weapon. Because you have a lot of range with that wall. So, I think this weapon has a lot of potential, but I think it's really hard to actually have it work out well for you, and it's hard to justify over other weapons. That's all for the armor weapons themselves. Now I actually want to talk a bit about these ones. I'm not actually going to go into the game with all of these because it would take a long time. I'm just going to kind of explain why each of these is on here as an alternative to these for comps where you don't have an armor. For instance, if you want a support weapon but don't want armor, you might have stuff like CDS and like K-Pro or whatever, where they're just not going to be taking those close range fights as often. Or maybe you have a roller that actively doesn't want the armor, where roller is kind of a weird thing where it wants to be set up but doesn't necessarily want armor, because the armor can give away where it is. But it does want turf output in a way in stuff to set it up. So these are kind of alternatives to various different weapons in this. They're not purely just support weapons or whatever. Like, these are specifically as alternatives to stuff I've listed already. It's like Mini, for instance, is kind of an alternative to something like H3, where it's sort of this ranged threat that mostly focuses on that sort of safe painting. It's really good at safe painting. And then like the burst bomb missiles are also helpful for assisting and kind of locating players with the why am I blanking on what it's called? Tenna missiles, right? So if you want a weapon that's focused solely on safe painting and setting up teammates through turf output and mostly turf output, this is a very good option to consider. Going on to Squeezer, this is mostly talking about like 96 cal or a main power up build for H3. Where it's sort of you've got like the range damage output. It kind of does a similar thing in the team comp for that. Then on top of that, you also have bubbles, which you can use bubbles to mostly cap zone or contest objective for clamblets. These bubbles are, of course, very strong in pushing clamblets. And then zones, like a lot of splat zones, you can bubble onto zone and instantly cap zone with bubbles alone. So it's kind of, the bubbles give it this sort of support quality, while the main weapon is more focused on sort of being that long range crossfire to help out your team as a range threat. So this is something you can consider instead of one of these. Not is on here for pretty much the same reason. It doesn't really have the support quality, it's more just purely range threat, and that's what it's really good at. So if you want the range threat and don't really want a weapon that's supportive, this is definitely something to consider over something like these. But not is the kind of weapon where you kind of want to set it up. Whereas like if you want this, you might want something like a junior to set it up. It's not necessarily just a fill-in for one of these, it's just something to consider instead if you don't want a ranged armor weapon. Slosher is on here because, well, basically because it does 70 damage. So it kind of do a similar thing to what 96 does with the damage combos. It is 70 instead of 72, so it won't combo with bomb indirects against people with bomb defense, and it won't combo with 28 damage weapons like Splash here. Although Splash often runs main power for 33.3, and so in that case it would, but you know. So it's not necessarily supportive, it's more just, if you want that damage combo, this is another option, without running an armor weapon. Splash is on here, it's sort of, in a way it's kind of like n-zap, in a way it's kind of like Junior, where it has that sort of kill threat that n-zap has, and can hold fights on its own, but pretty much what it does as a comp is focus solely on turf output and pressuring. Because it paints about as well as Junior, and it gets suction rushes, which are pretty much the best turfing special in the game. So if you have a team comp where you don't want armor, but you want some way of supporting the team with extra turf output, this is probably the best option in the game. It's just so good at putting out turf output without really losing too much, because the weapon can take fights and has burst spawns for that immediate assisting and stuff. Tent Umbrella isn't really comparable to anything on here, but it's basically a utility support kind of weapon in its own way. This Tent is more like Splat Zones and Clamlets and Rainmaker to an extent, but in Rainmaker I think is too slow to really be worth it. But you can use a kind of cheese objective where you shield across zone to contest zone safely. And Clamlets, you can kind of shoot it into the other team's basket to get to basket safely. But on top of that, you can also use it to sort of get your teammates into places other than just Clamlets and Splat Zones. So for instance, like pairing a tent in a brush, usually the other brush, wherever that is, you wouldn't normally see this being set up because it's not as good at doing brush things. If you're gonna set up a brush, you might as well pick this one. But you'll see brush and tent paired together because the tent just does a really good job getting the brush into position. Since the brush, once it's in, is really good, but it has a hard time getting in because it doesn't have bombs, it doesn't have range. It needs a way in, and so tent pairs really well with that, but also pairs with things like rollers and other weapons that might have a hard time getting in otherwise. And then Blob, this is mostly, actually both of these are pretty much compared to the stuff in this category. Where if you want some kind of ranged threat to control an area that also is a bit more assist oriented compared to things like Charger, Splatling, or whatever. Where in both these cases they kind of do a similar thing. They're not quite the same, but they kind of put down a bunch of turf output and chip damage from a safe distance. And that's kind of what they do. They're both sloshers, so they can kind of do a similar thing to Dynamo, where they're good at shooting over obstacles. And they also have plenty of range. So these are just ignore that for now. These are just good options if you don't really benefit from the armor, or if you want a different armor weapon, but you do kind of want that long-range weapon that's focused more on standing up for the rest of the team rather than being solely there to control an area like an Ely or whatever. And then Flingza's very similar to Dynamo in a way, but also very different. Where it's sort of a faster, shorter range version of Dynamo. Where you've got the vertical flicks with a ton of range, a ton of safe painting. Like, this thing paints a ton, and then missiles are also just helpful, and it'll get a lot of missiles. But on top of that, it has a better time approaching and getting close to people compared to Dynamo, where it's a little bit worse at controlling a specific area. Overall, it does a similar thing to Dynamo, so if you want something that's kind of similar to Dynamo but pushes up more and doesn't have armor, this is an option. If you just want Dynamo but you don't want armor, like Kensa Dynamo's extremely good. So like at that point you can just pick Kensa Dynamo, but Flingza can be a consideration if you want something similar to Dynamo but you don't want armor. And in a lot of these cases, like, there's alternatives that are just alternate versions of the weapons if you don't want armor. I already talked about Squiffer with the other two variants. I talked about Kensa Dynamo. Like, if you want brush, there's the other brush. Glugos, there's Decos, which are arguably better, but more situational. These are easier to fit into any map and mode, where these, it's a lot harder to get use out of them on maps that aren't particularly good for Splash Wall. Whereas they're extremely good on maps that are good for Splash Wall, like Camp Triggerfish. So, yeah, that's more or less what I wanted to talk about with armor weapons. I think it's important to focus less on what is the meta armor weapon or whatever, and focus more on what you want from a team. Whether you want something that's purely focused on supporting the rest of your team, something that kind of supports the rest of your team while also being able to hold its own. Which I should actually move this up here. I know it's the end of the video, but I think it fits better. Or if you want armor, but you don't really want a weapon that's supporting, it's just you want the armor and you don't really care about the support aspect, then something like this or something like these can also be good. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things to consider when thinking about what kind of armor weapon you want, or even if you want an armor weapon at all. If maybe you want a support kind of weapon that's not specifically an armor weapon because you want support but you don't want an armor. Again, like rollers are the best example of that. That's gonna be it for this video. I'd been planning on making this for a while, I just didn't get around to it until now. See you in whatever the next one I do will be.